Story 1. A woman, whom we'll refer to as entitled mother in this story, calls emergency services and reports that her home security camera is showing people breaking into her house through a window. She watches the incident unfold on her phone, seeing them enter and then leave a few minutes later with what appears to be a rifle. She manages to note down their license plate number and a description of the individuals involved. The police quickly locate and stop the vehicle as it merges onto the interstate, leaving the crime scene. Given that the suspects were reported to be armed with a firearm, law enforcement responded in full force, making the situation a major spectacle. Inside the car, officers find 4 teenagers whom we'll call Adam, Bill, Chris, and Dan. They are the only occupants, and all 4 are immediately arrested. The most serious charge against them is a second-degree felony for aggravated burglary. In this state, this charge applies when an individual arms themselves with a deadly weapon after breaking into a property. Dan confesses to planning the entire crime. The other 3 admit to participating in the break-in, climbing through the window, and heading straight for the bedroom closet to retrieve the firearm. The gun was stored in a case behind some clothes, as will later be revealed. After securing the weapon, they left the same way they came. The entire incident lasted about 5 minutes. Due to the severity of the situation, all 4 are assigned court-appointed attorneys, 1 public defender, and 3 private attorneys contracted to handle conflict cases. 3 of the 4 teenagers spend time in juvenile detention because minors involved in firearm-related crimes are generally deemed high risk. In such cases, it is common for the court to keep them in custody until an evaluation and supervision plan is established. However, one of the boys presents a solid supervision plan during his detention hearing, and the judge releases him under electronic monitoring. Dan's attorney puts in little effort on his case. At the very first hearing, Dan is advised to plead guilty to all charges. His attorney assures him that, since he has no prior record and is still a minor, he will likely receive probation. Once he completes probation, the charges will be sealed from his record. Dan is just 6 months away from turning 18 at this time. While everything his attorney says is technically correct, it is a frustratingly lazy approach to legal defense. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for juvenile defendants to plead guilty quickly, so their attorneys can emphasize their remorse and willingness to take responsibility. From my perspective, however, Dan's guilty plea at least gives me the option to use him as a witness against the remaining 3 defendants if necessary. The other 3 attorneys actually put effort into their cases. We reach a point where it is time for them to interview entitled mother, with the trial about 3 weeks away. To make the process efficient, we schedule back-to-back interviews, allowing each attorney to ask the necessary questions. The first interview goes as expected, with no surprises. While waiting for the second attorney, entitled mother starts making small talk with me and my assistant. This is common. People tend to get nervous during legal proceedings, and casual conversation helps break the tension. The exchange begins like this. Entitled mother: did any of these kids talk to the police? Me: yeah, they all gave statements. Entitled mother: what did they say? Me: I know this might sound strange, but I actually can't share that with you. I need to ensure your testimony is purely your own and not influenced by any information I provide. I hope that makes sense. Entitled mother: well, did any of them mention my husband? Let's call him entitled dad. Me: no. Why would they? Entitled mother: well, my kids go to school with these boys, and I think my husband is having an affair with Dan's mother. Me: silent, staring in disbelief. Entitled mother: I confronted him about it, but he denied everything. We're separating, and we were already arguing about that ridiculous gun because it belongs to him, and it's expensive. But I refused to give it back to him because he's a lousy cheater. I even changed the locks so he can't get into the house anymore. Me: staring, even more baffled. Entitled mother: so I was just wondering if Dan said anything about entitled dad putting him up to it, because I really think my husband is staying with Dan's mother. Me: at a loss for words, struggling to process the situation. Entitled mother: It just seems suspicious that the only thing they took was the gun. It was hidden in the back of the closet. How would they have even known it was there? Me, why didn't you mention any of this to the police? Entitled mother shrugs. I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to talk to anyone about entitled dad messing around with that woman. I figured maybe the kids said something to the police, but if they didn't, then whatever. At this point, my head is spinning. I respond as carefully as possible. Me, well, if they had permission from your husband to enter the house, then they're not guilty of most of these charges, including burglary. The first thing we need to prove in court is that their entry was unlawful. Entitled mother sighs heavily. Well, those little troublemakers still shouldn't have gone into my house, so just forget I said anything. By the time we complete the last 2 interviews, I am still in shock, trying to figure out how to handle this bombshell revelation. I immediately contact the detective and our office investigator to follow up, but entitled mother refuses to speak to anyone else about her husband's possible involvement. At this point, I realize I have no choice but to document everything. My assistant and I each write independent statements detailing our conversation with entitled mother and disclose both reports to all the attorneys involved. Since I am now a potential witness, I withdraw from the case. As a result, the case crumbles, and the remaining 3 teenagers have their charges dismissed. I also send a copy of my statement to Dan's attorney, despite the fact that he already pleaded guilty. His lawyer could have filed a motion to withdraw the plea, but for some reason, he never does. Maybe he simply doesn't care, or maybe he doesn't want to expose his own poor defense work. It's probably a combination of both. I have no idea how he could have justified the statement his client made in court, but he never even attempts to address it. 2 years later, Dan commits a homicide and is charged with first-degree murder. Eventually, he pleads guilty to second-degree murder. At the time of the crime, he is still on juvenile probation, which I suspect will weigh against him during sentencing. I had already left the office before the case was resolved, but I later saw that he had taken the plea deal. His sentencing is scheduled for next month. He will likely be in prison for a very long time. As for entitled mother, she never faces any charges. I have no idea what happened to her, and frankly, I don't care. She was perfectly willing to throw 4 teenagers under the bus out of spite toward her husband. And if entitled dad did encourage them to steal the gun, he is just as awful for manipulating them and letting them take the fall. One of those boys could have been killed that night. Given the report that they were armed, the police had every reason to come in force with their weapons drawn. If things had gone differently, someone could have lost their life. I sincerely hope their 2 children realize just how terrible both of their parents are. Story 2. To start, a large part of my father's family moved into my grandmother's home to sort out their job issues back in 2020. It was me, 14-year-old male, my uncle, 32-year-old male, my father, 42-year-old male, my grandmother, 75-year-old female, and occasionally my aunt, 38-year-old female, as she had a stable job. We also had a house cleaner, 51-year-old female, and a few dogs. When I first moved in, I quickly learned the struggles adults face when dealing with jobs and figuring out solutions. This understanding strengthened my bond with my father, whose sole goal was to get us out and into a home of our own. He faced issues with our family, as they often singled him out, and I was his only supporter. Since he and my mother had divorced, he didn't have many people on his side. I often heard stories about how my grandmother would belittle him while celebrating my uncle and aunt's achievements. I knew this hurt him deeply, but it also motivated him to work even harder. I had done some petty things as a kid that worsened his mental state, and I learned never to repeat those mistakes. As the years passed, I became more mature but faced a new challenge: my manipulative grandmother. One day, my grandmother openly called my uncle useless right in front of him. This devastated him, and he lashed out, breaking a lot of the furniture in the house out of frustration. My father and aunt had to calm him down as he wept in pain. It was my first time seeing my uncle like that, and it left me completely shaken. Over time, I started to get a better grasp of my environment. By the time I turned 17, I was motivated to contribute to the household through hard labor, feeling guilty that our house cleaner was managing everything on her own while the rest of the family was busy with work. Growing up, my grandmother would always yell at me. To avoid this, I clenched my fists and started handling more responsibilities to lessen the things she could complain about: chores, laziness, and anything else she could use against me. I even created a deal and agreement with her to reference whenever she brought up an issue. This significantly reduced the tension and made the household more peaceful, but I still had plenty of challenges ahead. One of those challenges was the language barrier. My house cleaner and I didn't speak the same language, and she used this to her advantage by making up stories about me to my grandmother. Since I couldn't understand what she was saying, I couldn't defend myself. Whenever I asked my grandmother to translate, she would dismiss me, telling me to learn the language. Yet, she was the only one who could have taught me the native tongue I should have learned as a child. The language in question is Setswana. It's difficult to find online lessons for it, as it isn't widely taught or spoken about. Before moving in 2020, I grew up in a city where only English was spoken, so my parents never thought much about teaching me another language. This is how I ended up in this situation. Fast forward to 2024-2025. I'm 19 now, and I've had to deal with accusations from my grandmother that I can't even refute, things like not washing the dishes or forgetting to feed the dogs. The worst part is that my uncle, father, and aunt always believe her without a second thought. If I deny the accusation, they see it as disrespect. I took time to collect myself and calmly explain my side to everyone, even though I had no one supporting me. Days later, they finally started to see my point. I've always been labeled as the naive child and an easy target for blame when others make mistakes. On top of that, the house cleaner and my grandmother continue to spread lies, winning over my family members. That's when I decided to do something that couldn't be disputed. I started writing down the specific date and time whenever I completed my chores, using my phone to record evidence. Now, whenever they try to set me up with false accusations, I have proof. One day, in frustration over all the pain she caused me, I pointed at my grandmother while speaking. She completely ignored the actual issue I was addressing and instead made a scene about how disrespectful my pointing gesture was. The house cleaner immediately backed her up, dismissing everything I was trying to say. To ease the tension, I later apologized for pointing at her. But instead of letting it go, she suddenly claimed that I had once muttered something disrespectful when she asked me to do something. She refused to specify when this supposedly happened and even said the house cleaner had witnessed it. I know myself I would never do something like that at this age, especially since my only focus has been maintaining peace. Now, I'm seriously considering recording every conversation in the household to counter their lies. To add to the madness, back in 2017, my grandmother took in my older cousin, 21-year-old female, while she was studying to become a doctor. One day, they had an argument about something I wasn't fully aware of, and my cousin moved out. What struck me as odd was that she never contacted the family again after that. This whole situation is beyond stressful. The thought of focusing on my studies and getting out of here has never been clearer. I appreciate what they've done for me, but this is just too much to handle. Story 3. Someone else's puke story reminded me of this one. Back in the early 2000s, I worked at UPS, loading trucks. I'd been there over a year, was well known throughout the building for picking up shifts and being a good worker, and had gained a bit of seniority in the union. Our normal shift was 5 hours, with anything over 25 hours a week being overtime, so I tried to pick up as many extra shifts as I could. Anyone working in a union shop knows a lot runs on union seniority, and picking up extra shifts at UPS was the same way. Most seniority got first pick, and it went down the line until the shifts were filled. Early on, I made a reputation of working my butt off, so some of the shift soups would delay asking for a fill-in until some of the senior guys left. As could be expected, this upset a couple of people when they got passed over, and I got some FaceTime with the union representatives on every shift. Ultimately, though, This just led to me becoming friends with the representatives and doesn't have any bearing on this story until later. So, as I mentioned, I had a reputation through a lot of the soups of busting myself, working hard, and always being available. That said, my normal shift supervisor hated me for some reason. I think it was because he was an old retired military vet, and I was a punk 18-year-old with hair down to my shoulders, piercings, and didn't care about impressing him in any way except through loading trucks. With us butting heads, I'd brought up a couple of issues with my union representatives' friends, but nothing was ever serious enough to push the issue. That is, until I got sick. I was in that state where things were coming out of both ends, non-stop. I wasn't getting out of bed for anything, if I could help it, so I called in. UP's policy at the time was as long as you let the supervisor know something like an hour or more before a shift. It wasn't considered a no-call, no-show. I called right at the hour mark, and my supervisor told me if I didn't come in, I was going to be written up for a no-call. Malicious compliance time. I rolled up to the warehouse looking like death. I'd decided to load up on fluids on the way in preparation for loading trucks after a day of non-stop puking and pooping. We had to go through security and metal detectors before a 1/2 mile walk to the building. Then another 1/4 mile or so to my load once inside. Those fluids started coming up just through security, and I also had to stop in the building on the way to my load to avail myself of the commode. At my load, my supervisor started going over pre-shift crap while I'm standing towards the back next to a trash can. Those that hadn't been near me on the walk in had already heard about my compliance, so I had a nice ring of free space around me when I started projectile vomiting into the trash can and over the surrounding area. Immediately, my supervisor shut down the meeting, told everyone to go to work, then asked me what I was doing there in that condition. I don't know, supervisor. It may have had something to do with you telling me I'd be written up if I didn't come in. I got sent home. Does the story end there? Would I still be typing if it did? The guy decided to still write me up for a no-call, no-show. I told him, what the heck, when he handed me the write-up, and he said to take it up with the union if I had a problem. Okay, ding ding, round 2. Remember those union representatives' friends that I'd made from picking up shifts and working hard? Yep, I went in search of one and had a chat. He had already heard about my ordeal, a mile worth of warehouse space, and word still traveled faster than it would have if we shared a cubicle. He knew I had been in the warehouse puking, and if I was there, how could I have not shown up? And if my supervisor was the one that sent me home after I showed up, how could the write-up be my fault at all? So he roped in HR. HR was involved in all the official write-ups and hadn't heard the story, but was aware of the write-up. So union representatives, and I told her the story. She called down and asked the supervisor to come over to her office. He came and recounted the same story. When asked if I'd called, he said yes. If asked if I'd still showed, he said yes. When asked if he sent me home, he reiterated that he had. When asked how I could be a no-call, no-show when I'd called, showed, and been sent home, he didn't have an answer. I was dismissed to go back to work. He was not. Unfortunately, I don't have details on what exactly happened with him. My union representative buddy did say that I wasn't the only one that had been passing along issues for a while, but this was the first they could really do anything about. Being management, the supervisor wasn't part of the union, and the union representatives wouldn't say much else other than it was settled. When union representatives tell you it's settled, and they can't say more, my experience has been that they're absolutely right. The supervisor kept his distance and didn't speak much to me afterwards outside of what was absolutely necessary. Story 4. Hey, I'm a Welshman, so expect some British in what I say. For context, I was low on money, being 13. What do you expect? So I scoured the father's mind for any sort of cooperation to create a yard sale. Or what I like saying, front garden sweep. He decided to help set up the front yard sweep, because something about me learning to save money or something. So I set up the sweep, and things were going okay. I had quite a bit of money, about 11 quid. That was just enough to get something useful to my joy, which was when I saw my Elite Ghost roaster on a spare table. You must have been pretty old to know what Skylanders was. Confused, I picked it up, with no intention of selling it. I took an educated guess and thought that my little brother had put it there. As I was walking to the house to put the Elite Skylander back, I heard someone call me. Entitled Mother, excuse me, may I have that little thing you have? My son would love an Elite Skylander. Me, I'm sorry, but I didn't intend to place it here. But it's here, so it must be on sale. No, it is not on sale. I have no intention of selling it. I worked hard for this. The entitled kid was whining about it at this point. Mom, I want it. You will give that piece of plastic right now, or I am calling your parents. Me. Go right ahead. It's not like they'll be in your favor. I begin walking into the house and get my dad. Amazing Dad, what's happening here then? Your son is not giving me the Skylander. I refuse to leave without it. Dad looks at the ghost roaster box and the Skylander inside it. He just pushes the entitled mother away like the boss he is. She is now screaming and blood red at this point. How dare you attack me? I am calling the police on you for assaulting me. The entitled mother then whispers to her child. I knew something was up, but decided to go along with it. As the entitled mother was screaming at the both of us, I felt a tug on my arm. The entitled kid was trying to snatch the thing from me. I decided I wouldn't hold back. I pulled the box away and shoved the kid away, which is when I had a slap to the face from the entitled mother, which led to my dad, bless his heart, punching her in the face. Almost in tears at this point, the entitled mother left the front yard sweep, clutching her now wailing child's arm. Me and my dad decided to close up shop and never do that again. We'd only sell stuff to charity for free because we were nervous to do that again. Again, bless my dad's heart. Story 5. So for a bit of backstory, I moved in with my grandmother. I'm a 14, and my mum lives really far away from us on the other side of the country. Now to the story. I was going to see my mum, and I was on the train. I was using my laptop to work on a short story/essay for school, and everything was going fine until the entitled mum came on with her kid. If you live in Scotland, you know what ScotRail trains are like. And if you don't, there's a kind of table thing with seats on either side instead of the default one in front of the other. I was sitting at one of these, and the entitled mother came up to me. Hey, the train is kind of full. Can we sit here as well? I didn't mind this, so I said yes. The kid actually decided to sit next to me, and I also didn't mind this. He asked if he could watch me play, and I said that I was writing, but he could still watch. He was fine with this. The kid looked about 8, by the way. We sat for about 5 minutes, me writing, kid watching, and the entitled mother on her phone. Then she looked up. Apparently she wasn't happy that her kid was watching. Hey. I looked up because this was the first time she had spoken. Yes, I said. Why is my son watching you play? Ooh, he wanted to. Well, you should be letting him play. Ma'am, I'm not playing, She cut me off. Of course you're playing. What else would you be doing? I'm working on an... Again, she didn't let me finish. Just give him your laptop. Ma'am, I can't just give your son my laptop. Well, why not? Because it's my laptop. I don't even let my siblings use my laptop. At this, she just snatches my laptop off of me. She closes my essay. Luckily, I had autosave on, and starts fiddling about with my laptop. I have had enough by that point. I snatch my laptop back and say, "Get your own laptop." And she loses her mind. Did you just assault me? And steal my son's laptop? I'm like 5'3" and a teenage girl, so I can't really assault a fully grown Karen. Then the person sitting in the aisle across from us stands up. Listen, lady, I've just phoned for security, also something on Scottish trains, and they will be here soon. So security came about 30 seconds later, and then she and her kid were taken away. I don't know where, and security asked if I wanted to press charges. The guy that called said it would be a good idea, and I just nodded, because I was trying not to laugh, and she got fined. I do feel kinda bad for her kid, because he was actually okay, and he has to put up with an entitled mother. Story 6. In September 2020, the apartment next to mine was rented out to two young women, both students. After settling in, they decided to throw a party. Normally, that wouldn't be a big deal, except Belgium was in full lockdown due to the pandemic, and people were only allowed to have one fixed visitor. Still, I figured, to be young again, and all that, I didn't really mind. At the time, I was working in healthcare. I worked with individuals with mental disabilities, but had also volunteered for the emergency pandemic team. This meant I was frequently called upon to care for sick residents who needed quarantining or had tested positive for the virus. My job required long hours, about 10 to 11 hours a day, plus a full-hour bike ride to and from work. Needless to say, I was constantly exhausted. While I wasn't thrilled about the idea of a noisy party next door, I understood that city living came with some disturbances, so I didn't think much of it at first. The party began, and I expected some noise, music, voices, the usual. But this gathering was absolute chaos. People were shouting in the hallway, things were being broken, and it sounded like a full-blown nightclub had opened up next door. By 4 a.m., I finally had enough. I introduced myself to my new neighbors and politely asked when they expected their 20-plus guests to leave. I also requested that they refrain from hosting another party the next day, as I had work and needed to be up at 6, and they promised they would keep the noise down for the rest of the night. They didn't, and assured me they wouldn't have another party the following day. Plot twist, they did. And then they threw another one the day after. At this point, I had gone 3 nights without sleep and was nearing my breaking point. Each night, I confronted the girls, and each time they were full of apologies, but nothing changed. On top of that, every time I stepped into their apartment to speak with them, I felt extremely uncomfortable. The place was packed with people, and considering I worked with vulnerable individuals, the last thing I wanted was to be exposed to an infection. This was before widespread testing, vaccinations, or much of the knowledge we now have about the virus. Thankfully, the weekend arrived, and they left to visit their parents, giving me a chance to recover. Needless to say, I wasn't particularly fond of my new neighbors. In the weeks that followed, they stopped hosting large parties, but continued to have a constant stream of visitors at all hours of the night. And by constant, I mean nonstop. Their doorbell rang at least 70 times a night, with people coming and going continuously. Worse still, most of them were intoxicated and loud. Our building's communal hallway was made of stone, meaning any sound echoed throughout the entire structure. It became impossible for me to get any rest. I could only sleep from Friday to Sunday when the girls would leave for the weekend. I couldn't understand how they knew so many people who would visit at all hours of the night. One evening, while knocking on their door yet again to ask them to quiet down, I ran into my upstairs neighbor who, incidentally, is also on Reddit High. We decided to team up to put an end to the madness. My neighbor had discovered something crucial. The reason there was a never-ending parade of visitors was that the girls were running a makeshift bar and social hangout. Since all bars were closed due to the lockdown, students were using their apartment as an underground gathering spot. To make matters worse, there was another student house across the street where 5 young men lived, and they were doing the exact same thing. People would alternate between both locations depending on their mood, crossing the street whenever they wanted a change of atmosphere. The boys from across the street also visited the girls' apartment up to 15 times a night. Most of the visitors appeared to be law students or associated with them. Essentially, our communal hallway had been turned into an extension of their cafe. My neighbor and I initially tried reasoning with the girls. Then we started talking to the guests, but none of them had any sympathy for us. Asking them to be quiet at 4 a.m. was met with laughter, as we were clearly those annoying neighbors. Many of them were too intoxicated to even register what was happening. When diplomacy failed, we resorted to calling the police dozens of times. Unfortunately, the police were rarely able to intervene. Most of the time, they weren't even allowed inside, and they told us there was little they could do if no one opened the door. We kept calling, though, because we wanted a record of our complaints in the system. Belgium was still in full lockdown, and what these students were doing was completely illegal. Even so, the authorities claimed their hands were tied. Since the police couldn't help, I decided to take another approach. As a social worker, I had no problem researching information and reaching out to the right contacts. I started calling around to see if any organization could assist us. Most places, student unions, the police, the town hall were sympathetic, but couldn't offer much in the way of solutions. Then, on my upstairs neighbor's suggestion, I decided to contact one of the girls' academic advisors. I drafted a polite yet direct email explaining the situation. I mentioned that a large group of students from his faculty was gathering every night, violating every pandemic regulation in place. I also subtly hinted that my neighbor and I were considering taking the story to the press, as secret lockdown parties were beginning to make headlines. The advisor responded immediately. He called me back, and we had a productive conversation. He assured me he would handle it. What followed was a cascade of events. The advisor contacted the law student in question, and, more importantly, her parents. Drama ensued. Finally, we were invited to sit down with the girls for a discussion, and for the first time, they seemed genuinely remorseful. Tears were shed, not that I had much patience for them at that point. We also learned that the police had, in fact, been inside the apartment on a few occasions and had issued fines for the secret parties. These fines were €300 each. I had no idea why they didn't just stop after the first one. The girls were also upset because the advisor had called them at 11 a.m., waking them up. To which I responded, "Well, there's your problem. You're still asleep at 11 a.m. I've been up since 6, and you girls haven't shown the slightest bit of consideration for that." It felt like a small victory. We got to vent our frustrations, and we left on somewhat civil terms, hoping that this would be the end of it, that we could all just live peacefully as neighbors. But if that were the case, I wouldn't be telling this story, would I? For a short while, things actually seemed better. The constant visitors stopped, the hallway was quieter, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was over. But of course, it wasn't. The students found a workaround. They stopped having loud parties in the apartment, but continued gathering in the street outside, treating the sidewalk like an open-air cafe. The students from the house across the street joined in, and soon enough, we had a full-blown street party outside our windows every night. They played music from portable speakers, drank, smoked, and talked at full volume well into the early hours. The noise bounced off the buildings, making it just as bad as when they were indoors. At this point, my patience had completely run out. If they weren't going to respect the rules or their neighbors, I wasn't going to play nice anymore. I started calling the police every single night. The officers would show up, disperse the crowd, but as soon as they left, the students would return within minutes, laughing about how the old neighbors couldn't handle a little fun. One night, my upstairs neighbor and I snapped. We had asked, we had reasoned, we had begged, we had even involved the authorities. Nothing worked. If the students didn't care about our sleep, our jobs, or the pandemic rules, then we were done caring about being polite. My neighbor grabbed a bucket of water, went to her balcony, and dumped it straight onto the loudest group below. Chaos erupted. People screamed, ran in all directions, and cursed at the sky, trying to figure out who had done it. We stayed silent, pretending to be asleep. The students eventually left, but the next night, they were back, this time, with umbrellas. Fine. They wanted war. We were ready. I got my hands on a high-powered water gun and filled it with ice-cold water. Every time a group of students got too loud, I took my position by the window and let them have it. A quick spray, just enough to startle them. They never saw where it came from, and they never stuck around to find out. The best part? No evidence, no proof. Just soaked, confused law students running for cover. For a while, this became our nightly game. They would gather, we would strike, and they would leave. Eventually, they seemed to give up, realizing their fun little hangout spot had turned into a battlefield. The street parties became less frequent, and after a few weeks, they stopped entirely. Finally, peace returned. I could sleep again. My neighbor and I felt victorious. Then, in early 2021, the girls moved out. No warning, no goodbyes, just gone. A new, quiet tenant moved in, and life in the building became peaceful once more. To this day, I don't know if they ever found out who was responsible for their unexpected nightly showers, but honestly, I don't care. They made my life miserable for months. It was only fair they got a little taste of karma in return.